George Washington University, you may begin.
All right. Hello, as was stated, we are the George Washington University team, or as we affectionately like to call ourselves, we are the GW Learners. My name is Naomi Suggs Briggedy. I am currently a PhD student at George Washington, and presenting with me today is Tyler Wyka, who is currently completing his junior year in mechanical engineering at George Washington as well.
Yeah, so to jump right into our use case, the Lake Nona Town Center is an up-and-coming clean city center looking to implement clean energy solutions into their mix as they push forward with development. During this presentation, we will take you through some of the work and lessons learned in the conceptual system design, our crack at financial analysis, and the development plan, and then we put in a little bit of energy justice and policy at the end. Next slide. Yes. So to start out with our conceptual system design, due to some time and personnel constraints, it was decided just to model rooftop systems. Now we started out with an idealistic design that was full rooftop, full covering of solar panels. And that was the maximum energy output we can get. But as we moved on through our design, we moved to a more realistic design that took into account existing infrastructure, ISCP standards and codes, and then maintenance access. And those are the designs we will present in this presentation. You'll see a second bullet point there about our rooftop design. There were a bunch of buildings in Aurora Solar that had to be pulled from building models and site plans, and we'll showcase some of the work done there. But then after that, we'll get into the component selection and our distribution system impact. Yeah, so moving on to our building design, some of the constraints that we had included the load data availability. So the buildings that we decided to model were decided by the load data that we had initially. We also had limited building maps for the modeling of buildings, and obviously the roof space for how many panels you can fit on top of the roof was taken into consideration. For our design principles, we were looking to build independent subsystems, meaning that each building would have a solar array and they would offset that building's energy use. And then we were also looking for immediate impact. So going back to that load data availability, we wanted the implementation of the solar panels to be able to see the impact right away, so we would be able to offset our load that way. Our goals, we wanted to really just maximize paneling and stay within local regulations. So on the next slide, here we are. We can show you some of the example of the modeling of buildings. So on the left here, we have a picture from Google Earth. And then on the right, it was a reconstructed building using Aurora Solar and building site plans. We use these rooftop models for a majority of our modeling. Next slide.
So within that context of our building modeling, we began to look at what would be the best photovoltaic PV panel to use in our case. We decided that we wanted to try and maximize our potential energy output relative to our space. And also really important to our considerations is recognizing that Orlando, with the rest of Florida, is experiencing more often and intense hurricanes. So ensuring that we had solar panels that could withstand the 2,400 Pascal wind rating as outlined in the ASC standards for hurricane situations. The next consideration that we thought was really important is to have the most consistent system over the lifespan of our project. So looking for ones that had the highest output guarantee over a 25-year lifespan, to consideration for what we expected the system to output at the end of the project lifespan. Based on this, we went with the LG Neon 2 400-watt panel. It wasn't necessarily the highest rated panel, but it had the highest output performance over its lifespan. And also looking a little further into the specifications, it seemed to have one of the lower degradation rates year over year.
Yeah, so now moving on to our buildings and the models with the panels. A lot of our rooftops just had rooftop mounts. But then for the garages, you'll see we had a mock-up of a garage canopy here, as those panels would be on an elevated structure so the cars could pass underneath. Yes, so here are the buildings to be selected. We went with the LNTC office building 1 and 2, and then garage G with the HQ office and garage, and the Wave Hotel. And all of those buildings got individual arrays on top of them and then were used to offset the energy. Here on the LNTC Office Building 1, you can see on the left here is the shading report and the irradiance year round from January to December. Up there is the building model, and then you can see our conceptual system design on the lower right. With this design, with the higher radiance year round, we knew that our panel design would output a similar amount of energy year round and would be viable in those cases. We went with a string inverter, and you can see that on the right with offsets that were actually manually inputted here. So the original ideal design had solar panels across the entire top of the roof, which really didn't work with any of the regulations, but the manually inputted 10 feet setbacks from the roof edge and then 3 feet from obstructions were added after the fact with walkways for maintenance access. Here is the LNTC. You can see we were able to learn more about the features in Aurora Solar, and there was a setback feature that we took into account here, and we used it to make sure that all of our new panels were still 10 feet away from the edges and 3 feet away from obstructions. A similar shading report is done here where we have relatively high radiance year round. So then moving on to Garage G, we have massive irradiance year round, and this is where we can get a lot of energy output. It was here where we decided to put a lot of solar panels on each part of the parking garage, and we went with a microinverter, for which you'll see later. We got maximum energy output. Through the microinverters, we'd be able to extract the most energy there. So moving on to our Wave Hotel garage here. The Wave Hotel was very bad on the shading front, so we were able to combine it with the garage that would help offset its energy use. And you can see the Wave garage has a lot more space available. So these buildings combined would offset the energy use. With the HQ office, you can see little lessons learned here was that the building wasn't fully complete. So we went with a bit more of a conservative offset here, just in case there was more mechanical elements we didn't take into account. But there are solar panels all throughout there. And then finally with the HQ garage, this is probably the easiest one geometrically because it was very square. We had a little lessons learned here with the ramp. From the 2D view, it looks like you can use a lot of the rooftop space. However, we need to take into account the off and on ramps when modeling this array. So as a summary at the end, you can see our energy offsets are relatively small. The ideal design had much bigger and much more favorable energy offsets, which would have helped our financial analysis. However, you can see we got about 47% energy offset out of our garages, and very low for our buildings.
So with that in, excuse me, with that in mind, we began to look at string inverters for our office building complexes, and particularly because they wouldn't have the easier maintenance access from our canopy systems. The main considerations that we took into effect were how many inputs we could have per string inverter, as well as their maximum ampage and voltage capacity. Based on those considerations, as well as maximum efficiency, we decided to go with the Sungrow SG250HX. This one allowed for 12 different inputs at the same time while having a 98% efficiency rating overall. For our microinverter selections, we were looking for something with a rated power very similar to that of our solar panels, particularly also with an interest on their max input power to prevent clipping, as these were on really flat surfaces with high levels of irradiancy. So we wanted to be able to produce as much or retrieve as much of that energy as possible. Based on that, we went with the MAC 400R, even though it doesn't have the highest maximum input ratio. We figured that anything above a 20% increase wouldn't be something that we could really benefit from in our project. So from there, we did our financial analysis, which was largely based on the list of assumptions we were provided in the rules. Unfortunately, we did not take into account any sort of incentives or tariffs that might allow for a more favorable outcome. So we ended up with just a straight discount cash flow model assumption for our 25-year period, and the annual customer saving, which you can see here, comes out to $5,766,385 over the project lifespan, We imagine with more realistically inclusion of tax benefits, tariffs, and other special accommodations for the state of Florida, that this would be a much better cost savings to the customer over the expanse of our project. Within that consideration of how else we might get some additional savings as we looked at consumptions, as you can see here is modeled from one of our buildings in Aurora Solar. We show the yearly hourly profile, and so thought about how we might provide some peak shaving between the hours of 5 and 8 p.m. to our buildings, and particularly using our garage-based systems, which have really high production, but really low consumptions values over time. So in order to see how we might be able to do some of that saving, we attempted to do modeling in the energy tool base with mixed results over this time frame. Largely what we realized is that by themselves, it doesn't necessarily, again, show a cost savings because we weren't taking into effect any of the taxes or benefits, and also just some issues with understanding how best to model the battery system overall.
Yeah, so with our distribution system impact, you can see a majority of our solar resource is located inside of that red box. Sorry about the slide here. It's we didn't get to run a thorough analysis using any of the tools provided. However, in the future, if we were able to consider grid connects or distribution system impact, we would be able to locate hook up to one of these lower PV penetration zones that are located in the lighter yellow. Yes. And then moving on to our little bit on energy justice and policy, with the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill, there are plenty of incentives to develop these new energy systems. And with these independent systems, we might have more chance at system resiliency in the event of extreme weather and natural disaster.
So with that, generally looking at our development plan, constrictions and choices, it was really important to look at land use and zoning compliance, particularly looking at the Orange County building standards, as well as looking at the Florida State fire coding and building, for what would be the implementation of our PV and battery systems. Also in the lack of having a district use case master plan, we generally try to think within compliance of what would work on a typical building as outlined in the Florida and Orange County code specifically. And this is just another slide sort of showing our thought process as we went through it. Our key conclusions from this is that this was a great learning opportunity from us, everyone on our team, as the members shifted over the semesters. This was our first foray into actually trying to develop a PV system. This gave us a great opportunity to use real world tools and see what some of the things we've been learning in class will look like in real world applications. The other thing we really thought about and began to understand is understanding the interplay between individual buildings with each other, as well as how to make use of large open spaces that might otherwise not have a ton of production value, just in the general use case. With more time and with more understanding as we move forward and look to incorporate this into our Student Energy Association. We hope in future years to work with our electrical as well as our management and business counterparts to ensure that we're developing systems that could fully meet the need, as well as understanding how to better include some of the financial components really beyond just the capital costs, but also the potential incentives and tariffs that we could offer to our client. We'd like to, and this is just a short list of references that we included. We'd like to end by thanking you all for making this opportunity available to us. We'd also like to thank our team members who were unable to join us today. And most importantly, we'd like to thank our advisor, Dr. Sonia LeBlanc, for her continued effort and encouragement in this process.